Hey guys, today we are going to be talking about a lot of the other colonies. We're going to be starting with the middle colonies and we're going to get into the southern colonies. So, if you'll recall, New York was originally kind of owned by the Dutch. You had Henry Hudson that laid claim to the end of Long Island, which is where Manhattan will eventually be put, and then sailed the Hudson River, which was named after him, and all claimed it for the Dutch. The Dutch East India Company establishes the Dutch West India Company, and they established their base of operations in the Americas at New Amsterdam on the end of Long Island at the mouth of the harbor of the Hudson River in Hudson Bay, and it becomes enormously successful and extremely diverse. Go back and listen to New Amsterdam and the Dutch if you want to go back over that. Well, eventually in 1664, the longtime rivals, the English, are going to take New Amsterdam and basically the rest of the Dutch colony from them, and it transfers over to the English. Um, the Duke of York, who will eventually become King James II. He is the younger brother of Charles II, the monarch during the Restoration, um, is going to lay claim to this in the name of England, which is hence where you get the name New York. New York, as a middle colony, as far as its culture, it's going to retain some of the diversity that it had under the Dutch control, because obviously things don't change overnight. But you are going to have a lot more English people start to come in. Now, these middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, they're going to kind of become the breadbasket, so to speak, of the colonial Americas, because they find that tobacco growing being extremely labor intensive, and also the fact that under the Navigation Acts and under the other mercantile esque laws of the day, um, the only place they could sell their tobacco to was, in fact, England. And the demand in England was high, but there literally weren't enough people to smoke all of that tobacco back at home. And so there was tons of product that just kept piling up without being sold. So eventually they are going to turn to wheat production for bread, and that's kind of how they become the bread colonies. Wheat production is not as labor intensive. This is also a somewhat cooler climate than, say, the southern colonies will be, like down in Jamestown and the Chesapeake that we talked about with Virginia and Maryland. And so you will have some slaves in these middle colonies, some African slaves, a lot of indentured servants up through the beginning of the 1700s. But it's not going to be the oppressive slave colonies that you'll have down in the South. You'll also have a lot of immigrants coming into the very diverse New Amsterdam, which is now New York City, from Germany, from France. You still have some Dutch people there. Um, and the Duke of York, when he lays claim to this, he also basically gets this land. He'll give it as gifts to some of his friends. That's like how New Jersey comes to be. Excuse me. New Jersey was given to his friend Lord Berkeley. No relation to Lord Berkeley during the whole Bacon's Rebellion episode. This is about 1664, so mid 1660s. New Jersey, lacking a deep water port, it kind of struggles to grow. It'll lag behind its neighbor, New York City. New York City is going to be incredibly prosperous because of its excellent geographic location and already established as a trading port along the East Coast by the Dutch. It's going to flourish. New Jersey will lag behind because of its own kind of hindered geography. Delaware is going to be an interesting crossroads because remember, you had the Swedes there with the original log cabin, Swedish log cabin becoming the American log cabin. At one point, most of the colony of Delaware is a plantation, but you had a kind of diverse group there in Delaware. And then the Duke of York, James II, is going to lay claim to it, give it to his friends. They're going to do some terrible um, whittling down of the population as they throw the Dutch out and secure their control of that region. And it kind of shifts somewhere between Chesapeake slavery and plantation style and kind of middle colony um, farming. Not really sure where it fits in. So it's kind of at a crossroads, the little colony of Delaware. So that's all we're going to say on New York for the moment. Let's move to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania literally comes from Penn's Woods. And this is another colony, just as Maryland, that we consider proprietary. That means that it was owned by a single lord, a lord proprietor, almost like a dictator. Now, with the Calverts in Maryland, that was a lot more true. With Pennsylvania, you have the lord proprietor William Penn, and he is, I hate to say the phrase, but he's a benevolent leader because William Penn was a Quaker. There's the famous symbol, you'd see on your Quaker oatmeal. Actually, the company has said, because this question gets asked a lot, you guys have probably seen Quaker oatmeal like at HEB or Walmart. Is that William Penn, the guy who founded Pennsylvania, the Lord Proprietor of Pennsylvania? And it says on their website that while the image is of a Quaker man who greatly resembles William Penn, it is not actually supposed to be William Penn. But they highly value the Quaker traditions. So, being a Quaker, that was a sect, a denomination of Christianity. Quakers were seen as very different, kind of like the Puritans. So, they don't especially get along with the established Church of England, the Anglicans. So, they're similar in that sense, but very different in pretty much everything else. Because remember, where the Pilgrims and the Puritans that established Massachusetts Bay, where they came over to worship their faith as they saw fit, Quakers are coming over for true religious freedom and toleration. They called themselves the Society of Friends, or sometimes the Society of Equals. Quakers come up with many of the traditions that have become American traditions. One of the most famous being that when you greet somebody in the United States, you don't bow, you don't curtsy, you don't take off your hat. What you do is you shake their hand. That's a sign of equality. And that comes from the Quakers. They were supposed to bow their heads and take off their hats to no one because they only owed subservience to God and no one else. And so that's where William Penn comes in. He is a devout Quaker. Interestingly enough, he had to wear a wig, so he had a tough time with the whole hat thing because he'd had a bout of really bad smallpox as a child. He's a little embarrassed about his hair situation. But William Penn, his father had been given this gift by King Charles II. It's kind of a gift during the Restoration when Charles II is trying to shore up his support and give favors by giving out this land in the New World. And then his brother, the Duke of York, will be the one to administer this over to William Penn. And it is, go back to this map here, it is a large tract of land. Now, originally, Pennsylvania, it's going to be a lot smaller, and we'll talk about how it became so enormous in just a moment here. But this is a huge chunk of land, and William Penn was also given basically Delaware for a little bit as well. Enormous amount of land, and he's very wealthy. But he is a Quaker, and most Quakers are very poor, so it's especially fortuitous that they have a rich benefactor in the form of William Penn that can help them find a new place to establish their Quaker roots at. Philadelphia literally means from the Greek, the city of brotherly love, although that's kind of funny today if you know Eagles fans. Their NFL team fans and other sports fans there are kind of rough. Philadelphia today is kind of a rough city, but it means the city of brotherly love. And back during colonial times, Philadelphia was one of the most prosperous, beautiful cities in the United States. That's why later on during the Revolutionary period, it's going to be where the Declaration of Independence is written. It's going to be where the Continental Congress is meeting. It was the seat of our power and our capital until the British take it. William Penn also he'll allow lots of different groups to come over here. One of the groups that comes to Pennsylvania are known as the Pennsylvania Dutch, but they're not actually Dutch people. It comes from the word Deutsch, which is actually German speaking people. And you can see still today the Pennsylvania Dutch, those are the Amish people in rural parts of Pennsylvania and in that area of the United States. It's not uncommon to be going on a country road and you drive by a little horse and buggy. Amish people refuse to take part as much as they can in the modern world and in modern technology. There's also a famous tradition where they allow their children when they're coming of age to go into society and try to see if they want to, and then they can rejoin the Amish if they decide. And but basically, a lot of the Amish people, they still today speak this old dialect of German, and they are very different. But this is a vestige of William Penn's experiments of unity and diversity and allowing all these various groups to come over. Unfortunately for him, he had this idea of a utopia where you treat everybody equally and kindly and use Quaker values to basically create, a heaven on earth, right? And he also applied this to Native Americans. William Penn's relationship with the natives was legendary. He sent them a letter basically saying, "I know you've been abused by others and you've been taken advantage of, but believe me, I am not one of those men. I will not take advantage of you." And for his entire life, anyway, William Penn was true to that. He always paid the Native Americans for their land. He negotiated fair treaties and always stuck by them, and he believed in treating everybody fairly. And as a Quaker, he also did not believe in violence. Quakers refused to take up arms, they refused to fight. They're a peaceful society. But all of that aside, what quickly happens is that the financial interests start to overtake the religious freedom and the political freedom that William Penn was trying to offer. Basically, greed takes over. And this does make Philadelphia grow extremely quickly, but you also see a lot of kind of unsavory things come in that William Penn had not originally intended. And when he dies, he's kind of a little bit heartbroken at what has become of his colony, even though I think a lot of the things that William Penn strove for really will have a lasting impact beneficially on the United States. Now, after his death, since this is a proprietorship, Pennsylvania will pass to his son, Thomas Penn. In the early 1700s, Thomas Penn is very concerned with trying to grab more land. So, again, there's Pennsylvania, it's so big. Well, this is where he's going to add to all this land. Thomas Penn is going to negotiate a resurveying of the lands from the Lenape Indians, the Delaware Indian tribe, whom William Penn had very good relations with. And they refused to sell him land, so Thomas Penn says, "No, no, I don't want to buy land from you. This was an earlier land treaty that you negotiated with my father. Remember William Penn? Remember how you guys really love each other and he was super nice to y'all and all that." And so the Lenape are like, "All right, we did really respect your father. If this was a treaty that we had negotiated with him, we can go ahead and we can do a survey of you guys and figure out where the border was supposed to be out of respect to your father." And usually on these walking purchases, the way in which it was supposed to work is that the English gentlemen and the Native Americans, they would gather together, meet up, and then they would walk along through the forest, kind of mapping it out at a leisurely pace. And they would stop frequently and smoke of the peace pipe and maybe do a little hunting and then maybe continue surveying. And as far as they could get that day during their leisurely stroll, that would be the farthest extent of the land. So, what Thomas Penn does infamously is he goes and he hires three like marathon runners, three guys who had trained extensively to run as far and as fast as they possibly could in 24 hours. And these three men, when the Indians and Thomas Penn and his guys show up, the Indians are like, "Okay, you ready to go?" And he's like, "Yeah." And then they start, and suddenly these three guys take off, and the Lenape are like, "Excuse me, what's happening?" When they realize what's going on, they leave disgusted. But the men continue to run and run for Thomas Penn, and they basically, one of them, I think, got 65 miles. The other two, I think, eventually dropped out, but they they made the border north of where the final guy ended up, and this is going to add about 1,000 miles, 1,000 square miles to Pennsylvania for the Penn family. Now, things like this were very, very rude to the memory of William Penn. to the Native Americans, to what William Penn had wanted to establish with the Quakers Society there in Pennsylvania. This was not a society of equals. And later on, this is going to be why important Pennsylvania figures like Benjamin Franklin are going to try to oust the ancestors of the Penn family. All right, turning south, actually really far south, because you can't talk about the Carolinas without talking about the West Indies. Remember, that's the Caribbean. Down there in the British Caribbean islands that were colonies of England, the most famous and infamous of which was Barbados, a slave based society had developed around the cash crop of sugar. The importance of sugarcane cannot be overstated. This picture over here on the right, that's what the sugarcane stalk up close actually looks like. Here's it in a field. Just as we talked about with tobacco, sugarcane is a very labor intensive crop to harvest. You would need to have like scythes or machetes or other very sharp blades to hack it down. And you're talking about making that hacking motion for hours at a time, breaking through what is essentially like bark, very hard surface. And then you have to gather it and then you have to peel it. And that would usually be the job of the women to peel it and squeeze it and get that sugar out of it. But sugar was so valuable back then. And that's going to make these Caribbean islands where sugarcane could easily be grown incredibly valuable for the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, the English. These Caribbean islands, because of their sugar yield, were seen actually as more valuable than like all of the 13 colonies of North America, more valuable than like all of Canada, basically. That's how important sugar was back in the 16, 17, even the 1800s. And out of sugar, you can make other products which were exceptionally valuable back in the day. Molasses, that that thick brown syrupy molasses. Rum, which is an alcoholic beverage that was a very lucrative trade commodity, all can be made out of sugar. By 1660, on Barbados and these other Caribbean islands that are controlled by Europeans, you have large institutionalized slave presence. A huge percentage of the African slave trade of the Middle Passage, in the triangular trade that goes supposedly between like America, Europe, and Africa. The Middle Passage was the route between Africa and the Americas. But here's something that is often not really stated. Only 5% of the African slaves captured in West Africa that went along in ships on the Middle Passage made their way to what will become the United States. Less than 5%. It's like 4.6 or something percent. Very small percentage. Most of those slaves were being transported to these little islands or to like Brazil, the colony for the Portuguese, or other places in Central or South America. That's where the majority of them went, but huge percentage to the Caribbean islands. And again, because sugarcane's super labor intensive, you need that many slaves. And since you had such a small number of white overseers and such a large number of slaves, that's also going to change the relationship. It's going to change the rules and the laws about slavery on these islands. You're going to have very strict slave codes, and they're going to have to be enforced, or otherwise, the risk is that the slaves could very easily rise up together and overthrow their slave masters. So, from Barbados, this British colony in the Caribbean, you have almost draconian slave laws, slave codes. They don't allow slaves to go out after night. They don't allow them to meet in big numbers. They don't allow fraternization. They don't allow them to do this or that. And penalties were exceptionally harsh. They would lose hands for petty crimes. They would be killed and beaten and whipped and everything else for the slightest thing because, again, this fear, since there were so many of them and so few whites. So understand this is the setup in Barbados, this island in the Caribbean. And that's important because as an island in the Caribbean, there's not much space. Just as we talked about in other places, a few generations later, where are these sons going to have their land? Okay, a second son, a third son. He can't inherit the land of his father. That went to the eldest. And so they quickly run out of room on these islands. Barbados has no more land for these slave owners. So where they're going to go is going to be the Americas. It's going to be the Carolinas. And basically, you have a transporting of the Barbados society straight to what will become North and South Carolina, especially South Carolina. There were originally 8 Lord Proprietors that were gifted the land of the Carolinas. Carolina is kind of a bastardization of the king at the time. This is part of the restoration we're going to talk about in a moment. But basically, along with New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, North and South Carolina, these are all lands that are given basically as gifts to those loyal to the crown of King Charles II, who was returned to the monarchy following all the bloody mess that was the English Civil War. Remember, Oliver Cromwell dies, and then there's kind of upheaval, and then they bring back the monarchy. So he's giving out these lands as gifts. Of the 8 Lord Proprietors, basically that they come from Barbados, um, the main one in charge has a really ridiculous name. His name was Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper. And he is going to be like the main, if you want a father of the colony, like we have William Penn for Pennsylvania. I guess we have the Duke of York for New York. We have, well, and also the Dutch, Peter uh, Stuyvesant and those Dutch proprietors. And we have um, William Bradley for the Pilgrims. I could just go through them. You have John Smith for Jamestown. But for the Carolinas, you have Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper. He's kind of in charge. They name the capital and the biggest trade port in what will become South Carolina. They named Charleston, and originally its name was Charlestown, so it was directly named in honor of King Charles II. And it's important to note that here on the map, it was only about 50 miles away from Spanish Florida. That's also going to be critical when thinking about a lot of the slave revolts that are going to happen in the Carolinas. A lot of the slaves who escape, they are desperate to get through this area that's going to become Georgia and make their way into Spanish Florida, where slavery for them was somewhat outlawed. They would have been freed. Many of these slaves coming from the West African coast, remember, it was originally dominated by the Portuguese who controlled the early slave trade. They spoke Portuguese, which is very similar to Spanish, so they would have been able to communicate. And so that was a big issue that was continuously happening. Many of these slaves, they would escape. And we talked about how the Barbados Society was basically transferred over here. Sugarcane will grow in the Carolinas, but they quickly come on a different cash crop, and that's going to be rice. This is the Tidewater. Remember, this is the Chesapeake, tobacco. The Tidewater, you're going to have sugarcane, but also rice. And rice, just like sugarcane, just like tobacco, is incredibly labor intensive. So you're going to have the slave codes. You're going to have more African slaves than you will white overseers. So incredible fear from the whites there in that area. They keep it extremely restrictive. And for those slaves that escaped, they would hire Native Americans who knew the land better to chase them down and either return them or kill them to kind of warn other African slaves not to escape. Typically, when that was the situation, the Native Americans would kill the escaped runaway slave and they would bring back to the slave master who would pay their fee the scalp of the African slave as proof that they had accomplished their objective. We talked about the headright system. Remember in Jamestown, that was a way to bring over colonists, that for every person you brought over across the Atlantic, you would get 50 acres, which is how a lot of indentured servants were brought over. Well, in the Carolinas, incredible land grants. The headright system in the Carolinas was about 150 acres. And a lot of these rich, wealthy landowners, they're bringing over dozens and dozens of slaves. Every slave, they're getting 150 acres. Every person they bring over 150 acres. Some of the plantations in the southern part of the Carolina colony are going to be enormous. In the northern part of the Carolinas, it's a little bit more backcountry. It's a little bit more woodsy and mountainous. And so you have a lot more smaller farms develop, a lot more poor yeoman type white farmers who won't own vast land tracts like in the South. And eventually the two will have separate governors, and eventually they'll split apart. And that's where you'll get the colony of North Carolina and the colony of South Carolina. So if you're thinking what's the difference between the Carolinas, the North was well, I mean, it still had plantation slavery, but it was mostly smaller scale farming, yeoman, poor white farmers. In the South, it's the Barbados Society almost transplanted over. Real quickly, history of slavery. I'm not going to go into like the entire history of all slavery that's ever existed, but just know that slavery has been around as old as civilization. Man has been enslaving one another. The ancient Greeks enslaved, the Romans enslaved the Greeks and other peoples. You had the Muslims enslaving peoples. And in Africa itself, you also had slavery, where tribes would take over other tribes and make the defeated tribesmen their slaves. Um, Slavery was nothing new, but the type of slavery that's going to develop in the Americas will be a sort of different new type of slavery than had existed previously. Recall also that there's not a lot of slaves being brought directly over from the Middle Passage from West Africa over to the British American colonies. Actually, a lot of this, less than 5%. Most of the slaves that are going to be brought over and not born here are actually going to be coming as traded items from the West Indies, from the Caribbean islands. That's where most of them will directly come from. The different cash crops. In New England, they're mostly going to be getting into the timber industry. And so shipbuilding becomes a big thing. Fishing is a big thing, but there's not a huge cash crop because the soil and the climate there don't really support large scale farming. In the middle colonies here, you have wheat, especially as the big thing, and eventually corn and other products, but it's not going to be huge, large scale farming. You will have some slavery there, though, because of all the wheat. And down here in the Chesapeake, we get to percentage of slaves. So we see in the Chesapeake, you have the 10 to 30%, and then in parts of Virginia, you have 30 to 50%. See if it disappears. And then 50 to 70% in that horizontal striped part. So really heavy slavery in the Chesapeake, largely as a result of the tobacco. In the Carolinas, North and South Carolina, down here, you see heavy, heavy amounts of slavery, 50 to 70%, more Africans than there are white men, Europeans. And that's going to be a result of sugarcane, but also rice. Rice will be one of the biggest cash crops down in the slave heavy South Carolina. Georgia, we'll talk about in a minute, but it will eventually also develop like its neighbor, South Carolina, as a slave based plantation society. And remember, as far as names go, the Chesapeake is Maryland and Virginia. The Carolinas, North and South Carolina, Georgia's coast, that's called the Tidewater. Okay? The Stono Uprising is one of the biggest revolts that happens in the early 1700s. You have it led by a slave who was either named Jimmy or Cato. A lot of sources go with Cato. And it's going to be several dozen slaves, maybe about 70 or 80, who are going to come from the surrounding plantations in South Carolina. They're going to cross the Stono River and they are on their way south to try to reach Spanish Florida where they could be free and where they could understand the language. Apparently, a lot of these slaves that took part in the Stono Uprising had been warriors back in Africa. They were very proficient at killing, they were very disciplined. And when they encountered whites who tried to stop them, they would kill them. They also went and, according to the white records, plundered several of the plantations on their route as they were heading south. Eventually, South Carolina will gather together a militia of over 100 white landowners and military men, and they will put an end to this uprising and kill all of the rebellion's leaders and everybody who took part. What they do afterwards is going to be the big thing here. They put the heads of each of the rebels on stakes, and they put those stakes up with these severed heads every mile on the road leading into South Carolina's capital, Charleston, as a reminder, a bloody reminder of what will happen to slaves who try to escape or slaves who kill their masters. They also are going to very, very strictly start to enforce and upgrade these slave codes. The slave codes had originally come from Barbados, but I'm going to read for you here. This is from Wikipedia. This is sourced out. These are the 1712 slave codes. And here you have, after the Stono Uprising, how they get kind of bolstered. So here we go, the slave codes. Slaves were forbidden to leave the owner's property unless they were accompanied by a white person or had permission. If a slave leaves the owner's property without permission, every white person is required to chastise such slaves. Ooh, chastise. Any slave attempting to run away and leave the colony, later the state, receives the death penalty. Yeah. Any slave who evades capture for 20 days or more is to be publicly whipped. Usually it would be by a cat of 9 tails. That was a special whip that would break your back and split it, and it hurt insanely. For the first offense, branded with the letter R on the right cheek for the second offense, and lose 1 ear if absent for 30 days for the third offense, and castrated. That means they cut off your balls if you are a dude for the fourth offense. Owners refusing to abide by the slave code are fined and forfeit ownership of their slaves. Now, before the Stono Uprising, enforcement was kind of lax in some areas. After the Stono Uprising, you can be sure that enforcement will be heavy on those owners who refuse to enforce these codes. Slave homes are to be searched every 2 weeks for weapons or stolen goods. Punishment for violations escalates to include loss of ear, branding of the slave, nose slitting, and for the fourth offense, death. Oh my goodness. No slave is allowed to work for pay, plant corn, peas, or rice, keep hogs, cattle, or horses, own or operate a boat, buy or sell, or to wear clothes finer than Negro cloth. They wanted to keep them separate. I remember up in the Chesapeake in Virginia, Bacon's Rebellion is going to also result in similar stricter slave codes and enforcement. They are wanting to keep slaves separate from indentured servants, for instance. And so the kind of racial slavery and racial discrimination sort of begins here. You can see in the early 1700s in a big way. After the Stono Uprising, here's the amendments. No slave is to be taught to write. Writing and the ability to read are especially important if you're going to um, get ideas of freedom and notions about what it means to be free. That's going to be later a big point that Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave, will make in the 1800s. That was what he said his path to freedom had been, by learning to read and write. So there was a reason why they made it illegal for slaves to do that. Slaves are not allowed to work on Sunday or to work more than 15 hours per day in summer and 14 hours in winter. So maybe giving some concessions. Willful killing of a slave exacts a fine of 700 pounds. That was the money for the British. And passion killing, 350 pounds. I want to explain this one real quick, just so you can understand how horrifying it is. Not only is the fact that they're saying you can, if you kill a slave accidentally by beating them too hard, let's say you whip them to death, you would only have to pay a fine, 700 pounds. Okay? If you killed a slave out of passion, This was typically like a common practice was where a slave master would sleep with his female slaves, rape them. Um, if she died from like the raping, that's a crime of passion. You only had to pay a smaller fine of 350 pounds. This is disgusting. The fine for concealing runaway slaves is $1,000. So it was very dangerous and expensive to try to help slaves escape, and a prison sentence of up to 1 year. A fine of $100 and 6 months in prison are imposed for employing any black or slave as a clerk. Don't want them learning to read and write or having them near the finances. A fine of $100 and 6 months in prison are imposed on anyone selling or giving alcoholic beverages to slaves. A fine of $100 and 6 months in prison are imposed for teaching a slave to read and write. Again, that importance. And death is the penalty for circulating incendiary literature, like abolitionist literature. Abolition is the idea that slaves should be free. Freeing a slave is forbidden, except by deed, and after 1820, permission of the legislature. Georgia required legislative approval after 1801. So remember, the Stono uprising of the slaves is going to result in a much stricter enforcement of these codes and those amendments to the codes that we just saw. And it's going to help to further solidify the slave based plantation lifestyle of the South. Let's go ahead and round up this lecture by getting our last colony in the books, and that's going to be the colony of Georgia. Georgia. Georgia was established by James Oglethorpe, and he was kind of a unique member of parliament back in London. He believed that there should be a place for those poor Englishmen, the one who were in debtor's prison, to be able to go to. And so he made Georgia a place for these debtors. They were technically convicts, they were people who had been imprisoned, but they were imprisoned for being poor. He didn't think that that was right. So Oglethorpe was kind of being a good person there, but he was very strict in the laws that Georgia's going to have. For instance, at first, you could not drink liquor or any alcoholic beverages in Georgia. You were not allowed to own slaves, which is a good thing, but for the colonists, they saw this as limits on their freedom. And there were many, many complaints from this penal colony. In effect, a penal colony is a colony for prisoners, even though these were debtor prisoners. And so eventually, these laws do get relaxed, and by 1752, the colonists of Georgia will be able to drink as much as they please and own as many slaves as they have the freedom to do so. All hypocrisy intended. And the slave based society that develops in Georgia, it's going to look very, very similar to South Carolina. Georgia was allowed to be gifted to, excuse me, sorry. It'll be allowed to be gifted to Oglethorpe mainly because, remember, Spanish Florida is down here. Georgia will create a very nice buffer between the British colonies on the East Coast, all the ones we've been talking about, and Spanish Florida. It's kind of the buffer, the protector to those. All right, so now you should have the framework for most of our 13 colonies, and we'll get into some more of what is going to happen between England and the colonies, how it's going to shape up eventually to a revolution due to the trade and the inequality with the trade next time. So thank you guys for your attention, and I'll catch you later. Bye.